This presentation is on ammonia safety. It's the Train the Trainer PowerPoint. And so this is an actual PowerPoint training employees of various companies that use anhydrous ammonia in their facilities. And so it's important to understand not only how to handle anhydrous ammonia safely, but also how to train others all of the things that they need to know. So I think it's a useful presentation to see how you would run a training in your company for any kinds of shift supervisors or others that need to handle this training task, responsibility. So it's not just a refrigerant. It is also a chemical that can be used as a fertilizer and can be used for illegal activity as well. So initially, it's really important to look at personal safety. If you have ammonia, the anhydrous ammonia in particular, you have to be very careful about personal safety, that you know how to work around that material and what you need to do, be responsible and safe around it. Certainly you need to know what the ammonia is and what are the emergency procedures. You've got to be ready for any worst case scenario. What if there is a catastrophic release of ammonia, perhaps an earthquake or some other natural disaster that you have a massive release? What do you do? You also have to think about prevailing winds. Which way does the wind typically blow? And if the wind typically blows in one direction, doesn't mean it always blows in that direction. So you should have a windsock. So you know, where do you meet? There's the normal position, the primary position based on the predominant wind direction in your location. But then if the wind is blowing in another direction, where do you go? So there are lots of accidents that have happened. These are just a couple of examples that caused death and injury. And it's important to learn from mistakes that have happened. So in one case, 15 deaths in the Shanghai incident. So first, anhydrous ammonia is pure ammonia, NH3. And it is ammonia without water added to it. And it will react with water even in the atmosphere. So if you expose anhydrous ammonia to the open air, it will actually react with and take on the water in the air. Now, it can take on a lot of water when you're talking about the amounts in a refrigeration system. So you would have to expose it to the air for quite some time before anhydrous ammonia lost its most severe danger. And you don't store it that way. You keep it in a sealed environment so that it doesn't react with the air and it doesn't react with other things around it, like the nasal tissue, lung tissue, mouth, eyes of the workers in the vicinity, all that are moist. The non-responding employee is an employee whose work in a facility that uses or stores ammonia, but who has no planned interactions with equipment or containers using or storing ammonia. And that typically is most people at a facility. Most employees don't have direct responsibility dealing with the ammonia. It just happens to be there. They report to work. Their job is a mechanic, a front office finance person, or whatever it is. You're on site, but you don't have responsibility. The responding employees are those employees responsible and trained to complete work in a facility that uses or stores ammonia. So it doesn't mean you're a first responder or an emergency responder. You are just somebody who is trained to be, in one way or another, handling or working directly with the equipment that contains ammonia. The Emergency Action Plan, EAP, is a plan put in place to outline expectation of all employees during an emergency situation. So we've already talked about that in a separate presentation, but you need to understand you need your emergency action plan or emergency response plan, as it's been called. And how do you behave? Who's responsible for exactly what actions if there is a problem? So ammonia is a compound that is in nature. It's in the atmosphere naturally. It is everywhere. 80% of manufactured ammonia is actually used as a fertilizer. And so it's a very effective fertilizer, and it can be used in different forms. It is also used in a solution with water for cleaners for household and commercial use. And that one has its own types of dangers, but not nearly as dangerous as the anhydrous ammonia because it's already reacted with water. And so it doesn't have the immediate inhalation damage that can be very severe. You still have to be careful. You don't want to be breathing in even the aqueous ammonia in an environment that doesn't have proper ventilation, but that's a different situation. But it's not nearly as dangerous in the forms used as a cleaner. Used in production of several manufactured goods, so dyes, plastics, and many other chemicals, including pharmaceuticals and even some illicit drug use. It is reused as a refrigerant gas in cooling systems, as we know. So the anhydrous ammonia is a very efficient chemical that goes from liquid to gas in efficient pressures and temperatures that make it highly useful as a refrigerant. Ammonia in the packing areas, it's used in the refrigeration process, found in the rear of the vacuum cooling units. Generally, the rear of the unit is isolated from the general working population. So you try to keep the bulk of the ammonia away from the areas where people are generally performing their work. And you have the machinery, the maintenance equipment, etc., as much as possible isolated in other areas and machine rooms that are not likely to interact or interfere with the normal worker areas. Easily absorbed by water or easily reacts with water. It is a lighter than air material when it's a gas. So it has a specific gravity of 0.6. And because it's lighter than air, it will rise up in the atmosphere. But it depends on the room and the temperature. It can come out of a unit and be concentrated near the floor temporarily. Eventually it will rise up, but you can't count on that. If a leak occurs, there's no hard and fast rules of exactly where the level of gas might be. There's a lot of concerns about how do you even recognize or know if there is a leak. It is an alkaline, meaning it is basic pH. It is well above 7.0. So that makes it very corrosive with an extremely high pH that is a potential corrosive hazard. When it's compressed, it is a liquid, and it expands rapidly from a liquid to a gas when you release the pressure. And the pressure in a contained vessel increases as it's heated. So the higher the temperature, the higher the pressure. The fact that it's easily absorbed by water is one of the primary characteristics that make it so dangerous and affects its other behaviors. Ammonia can be created by lightning. So when lightning is going through the atmosphere and it's hitting nitrogen gas, which is the bulk of our atmosphere, that nitrogen can be reacted to create ammonia. So it's something that is naturally occurring through many different factors, biological as well as lightning. Ammonia is released through biological decomposition and bacterial action. Ammonia is also taken by the water from the atmosphere, and that ammonia gets into our waterways, and it acts as a fertilizer. That is one of the primary ways that nitrogen gets into the environment. There's also bacterial action, nitrogen fixing bacteria that are common with the roots of legume plants, as an example. But there are multiple ways that ammonia can get into our atmosphere and get into our water. So ammonia binds with or reacts with water in the atmosphere, in your eyes, on your skin, in your lungs, et cetera, and this is why it is so dangerous. When it's reacting with the water, this high pH, highly corrosive material that is rapidly binding with water can do serious damage in a big hurry. To the point where if you took in a breath of sufficient quantities of anhydrous ammonia, it will kill you. And there, even if you were standing right there in an emergency room parking lot, it would damage your lungs too much that there's nothing they could do. That is unlikely to get that severe of an exposure, but it is very, very dangerous. So what are the levels of ammonia that are acceptable? 5 parts per million is considered the odor threshold, where you can actually smell the presence of ammonia. At 25 parts per million, that is the 8-hour exposure limit. So you can't have above 25 parts per million in the environment during an 8-hour work shift. At 35, it's only a 15-minute brief period of work. At 50, you have an 8-hour permissible exposure limit according to OSHA. But again, it depends on the agency. It depends on the type of work you're doing. So you can have under OSHA an 8-hour limit at 50 parts per million. At 300, that is where it is immediately dangerous. So it's really important. Long-term exposure at 50 parts per million. You don't want to be doing that every day. You don't have to memorize these, but certainly you should recognize the extremes. Symptoms of exposure: there's a very strong smell that most people can detect if you've got a normal functioning olfactory smell system, but that smell becomes quite suffocating, and you can feel it in your lungs. You get irritation very rapidly in your eyes, nose, and throat. You get burns or frostbite if you contact the liquid, because the liquid can be extremely cold. And as it's evaporating rapidly, it's drawing so much heat from your, your hands or fingers that are in the liquid. It is way colder than dipping your hands in ice water. It is something that can cause freeze or burn, frostburn, and frostbite very, very quickly. You soon have difficulty breathing and then loss of consciousness. And that's one thing you've got to be very careful about in an emergency environment. If there is ammonia present in a facility, you need to be thinking about this, because if you see somebody in an area that has apparently fainted, maybe your first thought is, I need to help that person. Maybe they had a heart attack or something. You have to make sure you know what you're doing and somebody has a proper respirator system for entering an area that may be contaminated with gaseous anhydrous ammonia, so that you don't have multiple victims. The person who passed out initially, plus the attempted rescuers. So let's take a brief break